When we introduced the topic of fantasy in our previous talk, we try to emphasize that fantasy can be understood as that which gives an arrangement to, which distributes, which gives meaning, which gives a narrative to jouissance, essentially. And we'll continue that theme today, and we'll continue that in at least two ways. And maybe just by way of introduction, let me suggest that what I'd like to do is have two frames of reference here. One is the more overt, obvious frame of reference that comes with sexuality, and we could maybe consider this as particularly relevant to the clinical realm, but we'll also be thinking of fantasy in terms of socio-political issues, in terms of certain challenges and certain forms of jouissance that appear in that domain. This, I think, gives us a nice way of both keeping a concrete, clinical, individual, sexual focus to how fantasy is utilized and how it operates, as well as being able to think it more broadly in the social and political realm. And in terms of the latter focus, I thought it might be useful just to highlight a quote that has always stuck with me. A colleague called Christopher Lane edited a book called Psychoanalysis and Race, maybe 15 years ago. And in his contribution as editor to the book, he writes an introduction and he makes this observation. He says, many critics and theorists have chosen to dismiss psychoanalysis as all too apolitical and ahistorical. What, Freud effectively asks, could be more political than fantasy when it determines the fate of entire communities and nations? This is a nice point inasmuch as it suggests that rather than thinking fantasy as some kind of flight of fantasy, some kind of whimsy, some kind of imaginative, disconnected stuff of daydreams, that maybe fantasy is a far more formidable and indeed structuring element through which one accesses reality in the first place. And if we're going to give that quote, let's give another one. This one is from Slavoj Zizek, and we'll make quite a bit of reference to Zizek as we go along. Zizek says, with regard to the basic opposition between reality and imagination, fantasy is not simply on the side of imagination. Fantasy is rather the little piece of imagination by which we gain access to reality in the first place. It is the frame that guarantees our access to reality at all. So a couple of things we could note about that. Number one, we're thinking about fantasy as a frame. And number two, fantasy is what enables us to have a kind of sense of subjective consistency in how we even see and appreciate and understand and engage the world in the first place, right? So fantasy is not simply an add-on to objective reality. There is no objective reality, or a type of reality. There is no reality at all without fantasy as the lens, as the frame through which that world is accessed in the first place. So those are two helpful opening comments. Let's link back to some of what we suggested in the first lecture. We had our example of little Jeffrey, who in the course of our discussion moved between being Jerome and Jeffrey, but we'll forgive ourselves for that. We made the point that, yes, fantasy can be approached as that concept and as that, maybe we could even say apparatus, that framing device, which enables us to give some sensibility to jouissance, which narrativizes jouissance. And we also try to make three further points. With reference to this Barbican exhibition of sex through the ages, we wanted to suggest that fantasy is that which orients us in the world, in the puzzling, real, to use the Lacanian phrase, real domain of sexuality. It locates us, it gives us a position, it tells us what is enjoyable, what is warm, in my own terminology, what is erotic, what is too much, but it also, I think, is important to stress that it is also what enables us to make sense of erotic life at all. And that's why I had Jeffrey there, and we could extend that suggestion now by saying, in a way that echoes the point I made earlier, if I could go 1, 2, 3, and evaporate all libido and all sexuality from your life, the world would look like a very, very different place. So presumably with sexuality there, one needs to find a way, one needs to find a position within that sexuality. We're going to try and find a few references to Freud to anchor, to guide us through this territory. and one that I don't often see in the literature, but which seems to me a useful way to think about this, is Freud's notion of the psychosexual stages. Now, of course, you don't see a lot of reference to this in Lacanian circles because Lacanians are not very keen on any implication that the life of the subject should be divided into developmental stages. Lacan is notoriously, famously dismissive of such developmental schemes. That being said, one lesson we might be able to take from Freud's psychosexual stages is that presumably you could say this is a series of moments where the libido is being schooled. And remember, for Freud, we begin life in a way that he would call polymorphously perverse. So the way that libido gets shaped through these various life experiences, and also to do a kind of Lacanian gloss or Lacanian rearticulation of Freud, you could say each of these stages is an encounter with the other, with the big other, right? Because each psychosexual stage involves orality, the role of the other saying don't eat this, do eat that, so on and so forth. But in each of those cases, you could say that the libido is starting to assume a more refined, particularized position. I would argue that although Freud's psychosexual stages might be said to be about the schooling of libido, part of what we are trying to explain and theorize is how fantasy is also a way of giving shape to sexual life, making it viable, staking out the difference between what is too much, what is traumatic, and what is viable, and indeed what is alluring. So that links us back to where we were, and that's also the reason why we're giving this talk the title, Giving Shape to Sexuality. You can see there, I've even mentioned we school or domesticate libido, and I've tried to suggest that fantasy locates us, enables us to take up a position relative to the real of sexuality. Now, of course, what we should bear in mind is, I've said from the outset, we'll both be thinking in terms of sexuality, and we'll be thinking more socio-politically. So fantasy needs to locate us not only relative to the real of sexuality and jouissance, fantasy also needs to locate us with the real of the social domain, the real of the socio-political domain and the modes of jouissance that emerge from there. So we're going to keep that in mind because fantasy, and one example that has featured prominently in my own research, is racist fantasy. How does one make sense of the world through a given fantasy, and what does that enable? How does that localize jouissance, and what narrativization follows on from that? We'll make a little bit more reference to that as we move along. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start. We've got a bunch of texts that we'll be using. Number one is we'll make reference to the Laplanche and Pontalis, the very famous text, their dictionary of psychoanalysis, simply entitled The Language of Psychoanalysis. It's not necessarily the first point of reference for many Lacanians, but we will make reference of it here. I think it helps bring out actually a series of key Lacanian arguments. We'll also be making reference to Slavoj Zizek's text called The Plague of Fantasies, which I believe is published in 1997. And the opening chapter of that book is simply called The Seven Veils of Fantasy. And what he fairly adroitly, succinctly, actually succinct is probably not a good description here, but what he incisively does is bring to the fore a series of dimensions of fantasy. And what we're going to do now for the rest of this talk and in the subsequent talk is to try and play those up, to illustrate them both with reference to Freud and with a little bit of help of Laplanche and Pontalis and with a little bit of help from Derek. Okay, so one of the first elements of what Zizek goes on to talk about as the seven veils of fantasy is, well, he has a little preamble before he starts with the first issue, the first key factor. And in this little preamble, he gives a bunch of examples, but one of the key refrains that he uses here, borrowing from the X-Files, is that the truth is out there. Or, as we could put it differently, that it's not always that the unconscious is a deeply repressed thing. In fact, more instances than not, in Lacanian theory, it's more on the surface, not so much deeply repressed. We've mentioned this before in earlier lectures, highlighting the importance of displacement, suggesting that we're not interested in Lacanian theory in a kind of depth model, a depth psychology unconscious, but we're thinking about the unconscious as distributed. And here comes a wonderful point for me about the role of fantasy. Zizek wants to suggest, he uses a couple of insightful examples. The one that always sticks with me is he says, isn't it weird? You get on an aeroplane, you in the back of the seat in front of you, you get that little safety thing. And it tells you, I kind of curse Zizek actually, because now whenever I'm on an aeroplane, I think about this every time. And they go, you look at this thing, and it gives you a kind of pictorial walk through what happens when the plane lands on water and you all orderly, you go down a funny yellow slide, you must take your high heels off, the boat will be waiting, and off you go. And he gives a whole series of examples. Basically, I think part of the point here is to suggest that sometimes fantasy is at the very surface level of everyday life. I'll give more examples. But what's interesting about it is it's clearly completely crazy. Anyone with any modicum of intelligence would have to say, like, firstly, the chances of landing on water are probably not that good. The chances of landing intact on water presumably are also not that good. So this whole bizarre, we take some solace, we feel a little better having read that, but it's all completely, you could say, fantasy. The point I would add to that is just to suggest that sometimes we're a little confounded when how we think about fantasy in psychoanalysis. And we have this tension even in Freud. Often in Freud, there's a reference to psychical reality, which is Freud's way, I think, of telling us that fantasy is omnipresent. But, as Laplanche and Pontalis argue, it doesn't feel like there's a kind of sustained particular segment of Freud where he develops a cohesive, systematic theory of fantasy. So fantasy is both distributed throughout Freud and never finalized in and of itself. And you could say that that seems to echo something about fantasy in everyday life as well. For psychoanalysis, it is surely the case, and for clinical psychoanalysis, that there is a repressed fantasy. In more Lacanian terms, we'll find in Lacan the reference to the fundamental fantasy, which is somehow defining of the subject, and which is also something that is not accessible to the subject, that the subject cannot assume. In fact, that would be a kind of traumatic situation. So we have this fundamental fantasy, this thing that is very much repressed, and Freud will say in his technical advice that this is not something that even can be interpreted as such, it is something that has to be constructed because it's that repressed, that inaccessible. So we have fantasy at that level. And to reiterate, in Lacanian terms, we might want to think about that as something like the fundamental fantasy. But having said that, you could say that we have little tendrils, or if you want to give the analogy of that as some kind of root, you've got little leaves of fantasy featuring in everyday life all the time. So let's give a quick reference to Laplanche and Pontalis, who make this point, I think. So in their entry on fantasy, they make the following observation, and they're trying to read Freud here and be precise in locating these ideas in Freud. On the one hand, in fact, this is a quote from Freud, I think. On the one hand, fantasies are highly organized, free from self-contradiction, and have made every acquisition of the system of consciousness. On the other hand, they are unconscious and are incapable of becoming conscious. Thus, qualitatively, they belong to the system of pre-conscious, but factually to the unconscious. We don't have to worry too much about the technical specifications, but what we're saying is that fantasy is an odd entity. It's not easily compartmentalized to the depth of a repressed unconscious only. It appears in everyday pre-conscious life too. I promised an example. I'll give an example. They continue, Laplanche and Pontalis, not quoting Freud this time. It would seem, therefore, that the Freudian problematic of fantasy, far from justifying a distinction in kind between unconscious and conscious fantasies, is much more concerned with bringing forward the analogies between them, the close relationships that they share. That's on page 317 of the edition of The Language of Psychoanalysis that I've got, should you want to try and find it. Here's my example. And I'm sorry about this, but there might be some rather vulgar or crass examples as we go on, but hey, what are we going to do? This is fantasy, and it is largely to do with jouissance and sexuality. My example of this, we'll give two, and then we'll round up for today. I suppose all we've really managed to do here is just to suggest that fantasy exists, as it were, simultaneously in more than one level of the psychical apparatus, to use Freudian terms. In locker room talk, or in drinking beers, or in crass humor, or when men go to the pub or the bar or whatever. There's always this kind of, like, it seems that enlightened, whatever, men, both on one hand would go, oh yeah, and obviously, you know, penis size, that's just juvenile, doesn't really matter. But it's just, you know, that stuff's all jokes, it's ridiculous. But yeah, actually, I think I'd kind of rather have a big penis. So you have this kind of joking ridiculousness on the one hand. Oh, we can dismiss it. It is nothing. It's just a stupid idea. This is childish, ridiculous stuff. Only little kids worry about this. But yeah, actually, I'd kind of think if I'd like to have a big penis. So you see, both at the surface level, the kind of jocular silliness, offensive, vulgar kind of discussions, which can be dismissed, but somehow they seem to also link to what we could say something like a phantasmatic identification or a phantasmatic conviction. In line with my idea, my kind of methodology here, both talking about sexual, individual, more clinical stuff, or fantasy in the field of sexuality and fantasy in the field of ideology, another way of putting it, I can give another example. This actually is an example that comes from Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. And Nelson Mandela speaks about, I forget where it is in his life, but at some point he boards an aeroplane. And this maybe is after he's been in prison for whatever, 28, 29 years or something. Because I don't think he flew much before that. Anyways, he gets on an aeroplane and his whole ideological life is about overthrowing apartheid, overthrowing racist ideas. And he makes a note and he says, oh my gosh, I saw that there were 2 black pilots walking on board the plane, and I had a bit of a start. And then I said to myself, Nelson, what are you thinking? Have you somehow imbibed racist ideas? Now, of course, my point here is not to suggest that Mandela is racist, but it's interesting that if fantasy is in part a dialogue with the big other, or if phantasmatic narratives also in part come from the big other, you can have a conscious set of ideas, you can have your whole political agenda, you can be Nelson Mandela of all people, who presumably is pretty anti-racist. But nevertheless, you can be quite startled by an event when you suddenly realize at some conscious level you actually did have a kind of racializing or somewhat racist assumption. Let's just develop that argument one more time, in one more way. Interestingly, Desmond Tutu, also from the South African context, in another autobiographical context, relates a very similar story. And I remember reading this and thinking, well, maybe one of them is unconsciously borrowing from the other one, but maybe not. Maybe you could say that there's something interesting in that both have partaken of the same fantasy, or as it were, that the same fantasy has in an odd sort of way overwritten them, and that it emerges in a conscious reaction, right? This is not something that is inaccessible. It emerges as a thought. And I think that is useful because in our very first talk, we posed this question. How is it that fantasies should be somehow simultaneously individual, particular to me, and yet also they can have a kind of stereotypical sense, a shared sense? And I think one answer there seems to be that part of that is because fantasies seem to flow from or be the result of our dialogue with the big other. Or let's put it differently, values, ideals, concepts, ideological values, maybe sexual representations that are within the field of the big other are influential. And my unconscious, remember, Lacan's one definition of the unconscious is the discourse of the other, that my unconscious is constantly in some kind of dialoguing with those ideas. So let's end there. We'll begin the next session with a little bit more focus on the first 3 points of Zizek's highlighting of 7 crucial dimensions of fantasy.